يقلل من نسبة المسلمين، لأن ليس هناك هجرة كبيرة من أندونيسيا، ولكن معظم المهاجرين من جنوب شرق آسيا هم من كمبوديا وفيتنام. وذكر أن الأندونيسيين لا يهاجرون إلى كندا أو الولايات المتحدة، ربما بسبب الطقس أو المناخ.
Now, if we continue, not all immigration to Canada is the same, because Quebec now for over 10 years actually has negotiated with Canada the possibility of controlling its own immigration policy. So we're living in one country, but not every province actually relates to the central power of Canada in the same way. In Quebec, there is a different immigration policy stressing especially immigrants who already speak French well enough to integrate more quickly and also retain the French character of the majority of the population in Quebec. So what we have is we have these statistics in terms of Canada, very recent one from 2006. And if you put the 10% at the top from Algeria together with the 7% from Morocco and 4% in the blue from Lebanon, of which a significant portion, probably a slight majority, are Muslims, you end up having something like, if my mathematics is correct, close to 20% of immigrants to Quebec coming from the Middle East and being Muslim for the most part. Which is why you now have Arabic as the third language spoken in Montreal. But of course, for a lot of immigration officers, it was what they would call an unintended dimension, because what's most important is make sure that French identity is retained.
يقول ليس كل المهاجرين هم أنفسهم، فالكوبك على سبيل المثال أو مقاطعة الكوبك طالبت أن تكون لها سياسة خاصة بالهجرة، وعلى الرغم من أن كندا دولة واحدة، لكن مقاطعة الكوبك طالبت أن تنفرد بسياسة خاصة في موضوع الهجرة، وحددوا أن المهاجرين إلى الكوبك لابد أن يتحدثوا اللغة الفرنسية ليكون اندماجهم أسهل في المجتمع. وذكر أن 10% من المهاجرين من الجزائر، و7% من المغرب، و4% من لبنان، فهذه 21%. فيقول 21% من المهاجرين مسلمون معظمهم، ومن الشرق الأوسط، حتى إن اللغة الثانية في مونتريال هي اللغة العربية.
But overall, I think more important than that is look at the diversity with the 38% from countries with less than 1%, or less than 2%, which means that there's an effort at really trying to bring people from quotas from different countries from really around the world, nevertheless. So yes, an emphasis on French, but also an emphasis on a variety of different original country or country of origins. Now, let's really move now to the center of our presentation, which is multiculturalism, interculturalism, and pluralism in Canada, and look at the origins in the West of a lot of the philosophical developments around notions of pluralism, and religious pluralism in particular, was the consequence of what we call the wars of religion. They lasted for almost half a century, and nobody won. It was wars of religion between Protestants and Catholics in different parts of what we might call sort of Western and maybe in some ways Central Europe. And these wars ended up sort of devastating in many ways the economies and the social reality of much of the people affected. And at the end, it really raised a very important question, is what exactly is the relationship between religion and politics? And of course, the following centuries ended up developing the Enlightenment period, out of which particular philosophers eventually, out of a number of different angles, developed sort of notions of pluralism, But it was linked, and this is why it's important to us. It was linked to this notion of the rise of nation states in Europe, a notion of that to every nation should be one state. A nation understood, of course, on this notion of unity of culture, of history, of descent and language, and even sometimes religion. And so, of course, these were often constructed or perceived understanding of history, and they were used politically in order to create a particular sense of commitment on the part of particular groups or of identity groups towards the development of nation or state in a modern sense of the word. That led, in a nutshell, and I'm going very briefly, and I'm simplifying history tremendously here, but it led in some ways to have a link between, in Europe, the development of nation-state and monoculturalism, whereby it was the majority culture that basically imposed itself on the whole, and in many ways, I think, assumed notions of assimilation of minority groups within the whole.
بالنسبة للتعددية الثقافية والعلاقات بين الثقافات، وذكر أن هناك مراحل تاريخية، فحرب الدين الذي استمرت أكثر من نصف قرن وبالنهاية لم يكن هناك كاسب، وكانت بين البروتستانت والكاثوليك، وكانت مدمرة للاقتصاد والأوضاع الاجتماعية. وفي النهاية ظهر السؤال الأساس: ما العلاقة بين الدين والسياسة؟ وظهرت الليبرالية، ثم ظهرت فكرة الدولة القومية التي تعتمد على عناصر اللغة والتاريخ والثقافة، والدولة القومية قادت إلى الوحدة الثقافية أو الثقافة الواحدة، والتي بالتالي تدعو إلى دمج أو إذابة الأقليات في الثقافة السائدة أو الثقافة الغالبة أو
Now, of course, if we look at that development in North America, it doesn't quite work. It's a little. There's some complexities on the North American scene. We see that notions of pluralism were rooted to philosophical roots in British and American pragmatism, and also a particular British experience of having to manage a diversity of religions within its political borders in a way that I think already put the initial steps of maybe more tolerance than in some of the other developing and emerging nation states, such as France, for example. We notice that the concept of cultural pluralism emerged in the early 1900s, and William James, for example, the famous American psychologist, defined pluralism in 1909 as crucial to the formation of philosophical and social humanism to help build a better and more equalitarian society. Now, here we are, in other words, faced with this notion of a cultural pluralism within the construction of nation states, which are trying to develop this notion of a united, a feeling of Canadian or American identity, especially as we move towards the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And so it's the challenge of what identity is going to be the unifying identity to a political a framework or structure called the nation state, and what elements of identity will be the diversity, and how to relate and manage the two politically. Of course, each of what we call nation states today has a slightly different history and a slightly different approach to how they went about dealing with this complex challenge. In Canada, part of what happened in the 60s is that there was a new burgeoning independence movement within Quebec, that among French Quebecers or French Canadian within Quebec, and in response to that, the Canadian identity was being threatened with the possibility of having one of its major provinces, where the second largest percentage of its population could end up, in fact, becoming a separate nation state. And not only that, but it's kind of in the middle of the country. So it's not, the idea, for those who have a sense of a unified Canada, to have a piece in the middle somehow leave, it became a real threat. And therefore, this Royal Commission was established in order to develop what